Dust swirled outside the Dust Devil Saloon, mirroring the turmoil within Sila's. He wasn't born Sila's, of course. That was a name he'd picked up somewhere along the trail, shed like a snakeskin after a life he didn't talk about. Now he poured whiskey, polished glasses, and kept the peace, or as much peace as one could in a town clinging to the edge of nowhere. His face, etched with lines that spoke of hard living and harder choices, usually held a weary neutrality. But tonight, a flicker of something else sparked in his eyes, a quiet resolve he thought he'd buried long ago. The Dust Devil wasn't much to look at, a weathered wooden structure with a false front that creaked in the wind. Inside, the air hung thick with the smells of stale beer, sawdust, and desperation. Lanterns cast long shadows, revealing rough-hewn tables scarred with knife marks and the ghosts of countless poker games. The few patrons nursing their drinks were a motley crew. Miners down on their luck, drifters seeking a place to rest their heads, and the occasional bounty hunter with eyes that could bore through steel. Silas knew them all, their stories whispered in hushed tones over the clinking of glasses. Silas was a big man, not overly muscled anymore, but solid like an old oak. He moved with a deliberate grace, his hands calloused but quick, always ready to diffuse a brewing argument or spot a cheating hand. He wasn't a man to be trifled with, a fact most of the Dust Devil's clientele understood implicitly. He'd seen enough violence to last several lifetimes and preferred to avoid it whenever possible. Yet, there were some things a man couldn't walk away from, and he had a feeling tonight was going to be one of those nights. A storm was brewing, not just in the sky, but in the uneasy glances and hushed whispers that rippled through the saloon. He just didn't know what form it would take. All he knew was, his quiet life was about to get a whole lot louder. The door to the saloon burst open, a gust of wind and rain whipping in with the newcomers. It wasn't the weather that made everyone freeze, though. It was the sight of the children. There were 7 of them, ranging in age from maybe 5 to 15. Ragged clothes hung loosely on their thin frames, their faces smudged with dirt and streaked with tears. The oldest, a girl with fiery red hair pulled back in a tight braid, held her head high, her eyes darting around the room, assessing the threat. She clutched the hand of a smaller boy, his face buried in her side. They looked like they'd been running for days. Silas's hand tightened around the glass he was polishing. He recognized the look in their eyes, the desperate plea for help, the raw fear that clung to them like a shroud. He'd seen that look before too many times. The girl Maya took a tentative step forward. Her voice when she spoke was surprisingly strong despite the tremor that ran through it. "Please," she said, her gaze meeting Silas's. "We need help, Kale's men, they're after us." A low murmur rippled through the saloon. Kale, the name hung in the air like a curse. Everyone in the territory knew of Kale, the warlord who carved a bloody path across the land, taking what he wanted and leaving only destruction in his wake. Anyone who opposed him was met with swift and brutal force. One of the miners shifted nervously, glancing towards the windows. Another muttered something about trouble, about not wanting to get involved. Fear was a contagious disease, and it was spreading quickly. Silas set the glass down with a soft thud. He looked at Maya, at the children huddled behind her, their faces pale and drawn. He thought of the life he'd tried so hard to build, the quiet existence he'd carved out for himself in this forgotten corner of the world. But he also saw something else in their eyes. A spark of resilience, a refusal to give up even in the face of unimaginable horror. He made his decision. "Get them to the back," he said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the murmurs. "Quickly." He nodded towards a shadowed corner of the saloon near the storage room. "I'll handle things out here." Maya, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude, quickly ushered the younger children towards the back. Silas watched them go, his gaze lingering on the small boy who still clung to Maya's hand. He reminded Silas of someone, though he couldn't quite place who. The storage room was actually a root cellar dug deep into the earth beneath the saloon. Silas had discovered it years ago, a relic from the town's early days, when folks needed a place to keep food cool in the summer heat. Now it was filled with dusty crates and forgotten barrels, but it also had a secret. A hidden passage that led to a narrow tunnel, a forgotten escape route from a time when this town saw more trouble than it does now. He pulled back a heavy rug, revealing a trapdoor in the floor. "Down there," he instructed, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay quiet, no matter what you hear." Maya nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She helped the children descend into the darkness, one by one. The smallest ones whimpered, but Maya hushed them, her own fear masked by a fierce determination to protect them. Once they were all safely hidden, Silas closed the trapdoor and replaced the rug, concealing their hiding place. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of his heart. He hadn't felt this alive, this purposeful in years. He surveyed the saloon. The patrons were doing their best to act normal, but the tension was palpable. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows seemed amplified, a prelude to the storm that was about to break. Silas walked back behind the bar, his movements slow and deliberate. He grabbed a bottle of whiskey and poured himself a generous shot, the amber liquid sloshing slightly in the glass. He needed to appear calm, in control, even if he was anything but. He took a long swig, the fiery liquid burning a path down his throat. He knew Cale's men wouldn't be far behind. And when they arrived, he had to be ready. He had to be ready to lie, to cheat, to do whatever it took to protect those children. He just hoped it would be enough. His hidden past had taught him a few tricks, and now was the time to use them. The saloon doors swung open again, this time with a force that rattled the windows. Two men strode in, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the room with predatory intensity. They wore the colors of Cale, black leather and crimson scarves, symbols of the warlord's brutal reign. The first man was built like a bull, his muscles straining against his clothes. He carried a massive axe slung across his back, its blade gleaming even in the dim light. The second man was different. Lean and wiry, with a cruel smile that never quite reached his eyes, he exuded an air of quiet menace that was far more unsettling. This was Vargas, Cale's lieutenant, the man known for his cunning and his ruthlessness. Vargas stopped just inside the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the patrons. "We're looking for some children," he announced, his voice smooth as silk but with an undercurrent of steel. "Orphans. They came through here not long ago." "Anyone seen them?" Silence descended upon the saloon, thick and heavy. No one dared to meet Vargas's gaze. The miners stared at their drinks, the drifters pretended to be asleep, and the bounty hunter suddenly found something fascinating about the pattern on the floorboards. Silas leaned against the bar, his expression neutral. He knew Vargas wouldn't be fooled by the silence. He had to say something, something that would buy him time, something that would throw Vargas off the scent. "Haven't seen any children," Silas said, his voice calm and steady. "This is just a saloon. Folks come and go, miners, travelers, you know." He gestured around the room with a casual wave of his hand. "Maybe they went on to the next town." Vargas's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Is that so?" he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. He took a step closer to the bar, his gaze locking onto Silas's. "And you're the owner, I presume?" "Silas," he replied, extending a hand. "Silas Blackwood, and you are." Vargas ignored his hand. "I am Vargas," he said, his voice cold. "And I have a feeling you're not telling me everything, Silas Blackwood." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "I suggest you reconsider your answer. Cale doesn't take kindly to those who lie to him." Silas met Vargas's cold gaze without flinching. He knew he couldn't afford to show any weakness, any hint of fear. "Just a simple saloon keeper trying to make an honest living," he said, his voice even. "What would I know about orphans?" He reached for a glass and began polishing it, the rhythmic motion a deliberate attempt to appear nonchalant. "Perhaps you and your associate would like a drink on the house." Long ride, I imagine, chasing after, well, whoever you're chasing after. Vargas didn't respond immediately. He continued to study Silas, his eyes like chips of ice. The big man behind him shifted impatiently, his hand resting on the handle of his axe. Silas could feel the weight of their combined scrutiny, the unspoken threat that hung in the air. Finally, Vargas spoke. "Whiskey," he said, his voice curt. "The best you have." Silas nodded and poured 2 glasses of his finest whiskey, the amber liquid gleaming in the lamplight. He slid 1 glass across the bar to Vargas and placed the other in front of the big man. "To your success," Silas said, raising his own glass in a mock toast. Vargas took a slow sip of the whiskey, his eyes never leaving Silas's. "Not bad," he said, his lips curling into a thin smile. "But whiskey can't hide the truth, Silas Blackwood. Sooner or later it always comes out." Silas forced himself to maintain eye contact, to project an air of innocence he didn't feel. "I assure you, Vargas," he said, his voice steady, "I have nothing to hide." He paused, then added, "But perhaps you'd like to try your luck at a game of cards. I'm told I'm quite the player. Might help pass the time while you wait." He emphasized the last word slightly, hoping to plant a seed of doubt in Vargas's mind, to suggest that the orphans might have already moved on. Vargas chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "A game of cards, you say?" He swirled the whiskey in his glass, considering the offer. "Perhaps, but I prefer games with higher stakes, much higher." The threat hung heavy in the air, a promise of something far more dangerous than a simple card game. Silas knew this was just the beginning. The dance had begun, and he had to be careful not to misstep. The lives of those children depended on it. The uneasy silence stretched, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the occasional nervous cough from one of the patrons. Vargas swirled the whiskey in his glass, his eyes narrowed, as if he could see right through Silas's carefully constructed facade. The big man remained silent, a looming presence that amplified Vargas's menace. Suddenly, a crash shattered the tension. A young miner, jittery with fear, had knocked over his chair, sending it clattering to the floor. All eyes turned to him, including Vargas's. The miner, his face pale, stammered an apology. Sorry," he mumbled, scrambling to pick up the chair. "Just clumsy." Vargas watched him with a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Clumsy are you," he said, his voice soft. "Or perhaps nervous." He took a step towards the miner, his movements fluid and dangerous. Silas knew he had to intervene. He couldn't let Vargas intimidate the miner, couldn't risk him revealing anything about the children. "Easy, Vargas," Silas said, stepping forward. "He's just a bit shaken up. Rough day at the mine, I imagine." He clapped the miner on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be reassuring, but also a subtle warning to keep his mouth shut. "Why don't you get yourself another drink, son? On me, calm your nerves." The miner, grateful for the reprieve, nodded quickly and hurried back to the bar. Vargas watched him go, his eyes still narrowed. Silas could feel his suspicion, his unwavering determination to find the children. Just when Silas thought he might have managed to defuse the situation, another voice cut through the tension. "I saw them." It was an old woman, sitting in a corner, her eyes wide with fear. She pointed a trembling finger towards the back of the saloon. "I saw them go that way. The children, they went into the storage room." Silas's heart sank. He knew it was over. All his carefully constructed lies, all his attempts at deception had been for nothing. The old woman, driven by fear or perhaps a misguided sense of duty, had sealed the children's fate. Vargas's smile widened, a truly terrifying sight. "The storage room, you say?" he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. He turned to Silas, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "It seems you were lying to me, Silas Blackwood. And Cale doesn't take kindly to liars." Vargas gestured towards the storage room with a flick of his wrist. The big man lumbered forward, his axe held loosely in his hand, a clear threat. "Open it," Vargas commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Silas stood his ground, his face grim. He knew he couldn't stall any longer. He had to think fast, had to find a way to protect those children. Violence wouldn't solve anything. It would only put them in more danger. Wait, Silas said, raising a hand. There's no need for this. He looked directly at Vargas, his eyes pleading. Those children, they're just scared. They've been through a lot. Vargas chuckled a harsh, humorless sound. Scared, they're running from Kale. They're rebels, traitors. They deserve what they get. They're children, Silas retorted, his voice rising slightly. They don't understand politics. They just want to be safe. Safety is a luxury they can't afford, Vargas said, his voice cold and implacable. Now open the door or I'll have my friend here do it for you. And trust me, you won't like the way he does it. He nodded towards the big man who grinned, revealing a set of yellowed teeth. Silas knew he was cornered. He couldn't reason with Vargas, couldn't appeal to his humanity. He had to find another way, a way that wouldn't involve bloodshed. All right, Silas said, his voice calm despite the turmoil raging inside him. I'll open the door, but on one condition. Vargas raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A condition, he said, his lips curling into a sardonic smile. And what makes you think you're in a position to make demands? Because I know you, Vargas, Silas said, his voice steady. I know you're not just a brute, you're a gambler. A strategist, you enjoy a good challenge. He paused, letting his words sink in. So here's my condition, a game, one game. If I win, you leave the children alone. You ride out of here and never come back. If you win, you get the children. And this saloon, everything. Vargas stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Silas's for any sign of weakness, any hint of desperation. Finally, he nodded slowly. A game, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I like it. What do you have in mind? Poker, Silas said, his voice firm. 5-card draw, winner takes all. Vargas considered the offer, his eyes glinting with amusement. Poker, eh? A game of chance. I prefer games where skill and persuasion play a larger role. Skill is involved, Silas countered, and I assure you I'm very persuasive when the stakes are high. He met Vargas's gaze unflinchingly. Besides, what's more persuasive than the threat of losing everything? Vargas chuckled, a low, menacing sound. Very well, Silas Blackwood, poker it is, but let's make things interesting, shall we? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver coin, flipping it into the air. Heads we play your way, 5-card draw. Tails we play my way, dealer's choice, and I choose the dealer. The coin spun in the air, catching the lamplight, before landing with a clink on the bar. Vargas covered it with his hand, then slowly revealed the result. Heads, he announced, his smile widening. Looks like we're playing your game, Silas, but don't think that gives you an advantage. I'm a quick learner. Silas nodded, his expression unreadable. He hadn't expected Vargas to agree so easily. He knew Vargas was a dangerous opponent, a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But Silas had no choice. He had to play, had to win. He gestured towards a large, round table in the center of the saloon, the one usually reserved for the highest stakes games. Let's get started then, Silas said, his voice calm. The sooner we begin, the sooner this will be over. He walked towards the table, his every step measured, his mind racing. He had to focus, had to read Vargas's tells, had to play the game of his life. The lives of those children depended on it. He just hoped he was good enough. He hoped his hidden past had prepared him for this moment. He hoped he could win. The other patrons watched in stunned silence, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and fascination. They knew what was at stake. They knew that the fate of the children and perhaps even the fate of the town hung in the balance. The game was about to begin. The poker table, usually a source of boisterous laughter and clinking glasses, now stood bathed in an unsettling silence. The only light came from a single flickering lantern suspended above the table, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with anticipation. The air was thick with tension. heavy with the unspoken weight of the orphans' lives. The patrons of the Dust Devil had formed a tight circle around the table, their faces pale and drawn. They watched Silas and Vargas with a mixture of fear and fascination, their eyes darting back and forth between the two men, as if trying to predict the outcome of the game. Even the usual sounds of the saloon seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The creaking of the floorboards, the whistling of the wind through the cracks in the walls, the distant howl of a coyote, all were amplified, adding to the sense of unease. Silas sat across from Vargas, his face a mask of calm, but beneath the surface his mind was racing. He could feel the eyes of the children on him, even though they were hidden beneath the saloon. He knew they were listening, their small hearts pounding with fear. He had to win, he had to protect them. Vargas, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. He leaned back in his chair, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. He exuded confidence, a quiet arrogance that was both unsettling and intimidating. The big man stood behind him, his axe glinting in the lamplight, a constant reminder of the stakes. Silas reached for the deck of cards, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He shuffled them with practiced ease, the rhythmic sound a small act of defiance against the oppressive silence. He offered the deck to Vargas to cut, but Vargas waved his hand dismissively. "Deal," Vargas said, his eyes fixed on Silas's. "Let's see what you've got, Silas Blackwood. Let's see if you're as good as you think you are." Silas dealt the cards, one by one, his movements precise and deliberate. The fate of the children, the fate of the Dust Devil, the fate of his own soul, all rested on the turn of a card. The game had begun. And the stakes were higher than ever before. Silas glanced at his hand, a pair of sevens, a 10, a jack, and a queen, not great but not terrible either. He kept his expression neutral, revealing nothing. He knew that in poker, appearances were everything. He watched Vargas carefully as he examined his own hand. A slight tightening of the lips, a barely perceptible flicker in the eyes. Vargas was trying to hide his reaction, but Silas saw it. Vargas had something, maybe not a great hand, but something better than Silas's. Silas knew he couldn't win this game by playing it safe. He had to take risks, had to push Vargas to the limit. But he also had to be smart, had to pick his moments carefully. He subtly adjusted his position in his chair, ensuring he could see the trapdoor concealed beneath the rug. He couldn't see Maya, couldn't speak to her, but he hoped she could sense his determination, his resolve. He hoped she knew he was doing everything he could to protect them. "Well, Silas," Vargas said, breaking the silence. "Are you going to play, or are you just going to admire your cards all night?" Silas met Vargas's gaze, his eyes steady. "I'm thinking," he said, his voice calm. "This is a big decision after all, lives are at stake." He paused, then added, "I'll raise you $50. Vargas chuckled. $50? That's all you've got? I thought you said you were a high-stakes player." He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a wad of bills, peeling off several. "I'll see your 50 and raise you 200. The patrons gasped. $200 was a fortune in this town. Silas knew he was being tested, pushed to the limit. He looked at his cards again, weighing his options. He could fold, save what little money he had left, and hope for a better hand later, but he couldn't afford to play it safe. Not now. "I'll see your 200, Silas said, his voice firm, "and raise you everything I have on the table." He pushed his remaining chips and bills into the center of the table, a gesture that was both daring and desperate. He was all in. He had nothing left to lose. Vargas's eyes widened slightly, his smile faltering for the first time. He hadn't expected Silas to go all in. He knew that Silas was serious, that he was willing to risk everything to protect those children. Vargas stared at Silas for a long moment, his eyes searching for any sign of weakness, any hint of bluff. But Silas's face remained impassive, his eyes steady and unwavering. Finally, Vargas spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "You're bluffing," he said. "I can feel it, you don't have anything." Silas simply smiled, a small, enigmatic smile that revealed nothing. "Are you willing to call me and find out?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. The tension in the saloon was almost unbearable. The fate of the children, the fate of the dust devil, all hung in the balance, waiting for Vargas to make his decision. Vargas hesitated, his eyes darting between Silas and the pile of money in the center of the table. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the heavy breathing of the onlookers. Finally, he shook his head, a look of grudging respect in his eyes. "All right, Silas," he said, his voice low. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but I'm not going to risk everything on a hunch. I fold." He tossed his cards face down onto the table, conceding the hand. A collective sigh of relief swept through the saloon. The patrons exchanged nervous glances, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Silas had won, but it was just one hand. The game was far from over. Silas raked in the money, his expression still impassive. He knew that Vargas wouldn't give up easily. He was a predator, a man who was used to getting what he wanted, and he wouldn't let a little setback deter him. The next few hands were a blur. Silas played cautiously, carefully observing Vargas's tells, picking his spots. He won a few small pots, enough to keep himself in the game, but Vargas was slowly chipping away at his stack, his confidence growing with each victory. Then a stroke of luck. Silas drew 3 aces, giving him a full house. He played it cool, barely allowing himself a flicker of a smile. He raised the stakes aggressively, forcing Vargas to call. Vargas hesitated, his eyes narrowed. He studied Silas's face, searching for any sign of deception, but Silas's mask remained firmly in place. Finally, Vargas called, revealing a pair of kings. Silas showed his full house, and a collective gasp swept through the saloon. He had won a major pot, significantly increasing his stack. A wave of hope washed over the patrons. They dared to believe that Silas might actually win, that he might actually save the children. Even the children, hidden beneath the saloon, could sense the shift in momentum. A small cheer, quickly stifled, echoed faintly from below. Silas knew he couldn't let the momentum slip. He had to keep the pressure on Vargas, had to keep him on the defensive. He had a glimmer of hope, a chance to pull off the impossible. But he also knew that Vargas was a dangerous opponent, a man who wouldn't hesitate to cheat, to lie, to do whatever it took to win. The game was far from over, and the stakes were about to get even higher. Vargas's smile had vanished. The loss of the last hand had clearly shaken him. He started playing more aggressively, betting large sums on weak hands, trying to intimidate Silas into folding. But Silas refused to be intimidated. He called Vargas's bluffs, winning several small pots and further eroding Vargas's confidence. Frustration began to creep into Vargas's eyes. He started fidgeting in his chair, drumming his fingers on the table, his gaze darting around the room. Silas knew he was losing control. Then it started. A subtle movement, a fleeting glimpse of a card up his sleeve. Vargas was cheating. He was palming cards, swapping them out when he thought no one was looking. Silas saw it all. He'd seen it before, in countless poker games in back alleys and smoky saloons. He knew the signs, the subtle tells that gave a cheater away. He could call Vargas out, expose him in front of everyone, but that would likely lead to violence. Vargas wouldn't take kindly to being accused of cheating. And Silas couldn't risk a shootout, not with the children hidden beneath the saloon. He had to be smart. He had to find a way to expose Vargas without putting the children in danger. He let Vargas cheat for a few more hands, carefully observing his methods, gathering evidence. Vargas, emboldened by his cheating, began to grow bolder. He started making threats, subtle at first, but then more overt. He would stare at Silas intently, his eyes filled with malice. He would make veiled references to Kale, reminding everyone of the warlord's brutal power. The big man behind Vargas also joined in the intimidation, flexing his muscles, fondling his axe, his eyes sweeping over the patrons, daring anyone to interfere. The tension in the saloon was almost unbearable. Silas knew he had to act soon. Vargas was getting desperate, and a desperate man was a dangerous man. He had to find a way to turn the tables, to expose Vargas's cheating and reclaim control of the game. He just had to figure out how. He took a slow, deliberate drink and watched Vargas's eyes. He saw a twitch, a tick he hadn't seen before. It was close to his left eye. He was definitely cheating. The question was how to show it to the world without starting a war. He needed a plan, and he needed it now. The game was reaching its climax, and the fate of the children hung precariously in the balance. The next hand could be the last. He could feel the blood rushing through his veins, a lifetime of violence about to surface. He had to control it. He had to focus. For Maya, for the kids, for a future he never thought he'd be a part of. Silas took a deep breath, focusing his gaze on Vargas. He could feel the weight of the children's lives pressing down on him, the hopes of the patrons urging him forward. This was it, the final hand. He dealt the cards, his movements slow and deliberate. He glanced at his own hand, 2 pairs, 8s, and queens. Not a bad hand, but not a guaranteed winner either. He looked at Vargas, searching for any sign, any tell that would give him an edge. Vargas picked up his cards, his eyes widening slightly. A flush crept up his neck and his left eye twitched uncontrollably. Silas knew. Vargas had a monster hand, something big, maybe even a straight or a flush. But Silas also knew that Vargas was cheating. He had to find a way to expose him, to turn the tables, to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. He decided to take a gamble, a desperate gamble that could either save the children or condemn them to a terrible fate. "I know you're cheating, Vargas," Silas said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the tension in the saloon. Vargas's face went pale. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support. The big man behind him tensed, his hand gripping the handle of his axe. "What are you talking about, Silas?" Vargas stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not cheating." "Yes, you are," Silas countered, his voice firm. "I've been watching you, the way you fidget with your sleeve, the way your left eye twitches when you're holding a good card. You've been palming cards, swapping them out when you think no one's looking." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I could call you out right now, expose you in front of everyone, but that would lead to violence, and I don't want that. I don't want anyone to get hurt." He took another deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. "So here's what I propose, a final bet, everything. The children's lives versus your position within Kale's army. If I win, you leave the children alone. You ride out of here and never come back, and you tell Kale that you failed. That you couldn't find them, but if you win, you get the children. And you get to tell Kale that you caught them, but you also have to tell him that you cheated to do it." The saloon erupted in a cacophony of gasps and whispers. The stakes had been raised to an unimaginable level. The children's lives, the fate of the saloon, and now Vargas's own position within Kale's army all hung in the balance. Vargas stared at Silas, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and fear. He knew that Silas had him cornered. He could call Silas's bluff, risk being exposed as a cheater, or he could fold, concede the game, and face the wrath of Kale. His hands began to sweat. He could feel all eyes in the saloon upon him. What was he going to do? His entire life, who he was about to be decided by this one hand. He looked at his cards. He had a full house, aces over kings. Surely Silas was bluffing, wasn't he? The silence was deafening. All eyes were on Vargas, waiting for him to make his choice. Silas, despite the turmoil raging within him, maintained his composure. He stared at Vargas, his gaze unwavering, projecting an air of unwavering confidence. He knew he was walking a tightrope. He was bluffing, betting everything on a hunch, on his ability to read Vargas, on his knowledge of human nature. He didn't have a winning hand. He had 2 pairs, 8s, and queens, not enough to beat Vargas's likely full house. But he had something else, leverage. He knew Vargas was cheating, and he knew that exposing him would have devastating consequences. Not just for Vargas, but for Kale as well. It would reveal a weakness, a crack in the warlord's armor. Silas had to make Vargas believe that he was willing to call his bluff, to expose his cheating, even if it meant risking his own life and the lives of the children. He had to make Vargas believe that he was more afraid of Cale finding out about his cheating than he was of losing the game. "Well, Vargas," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, "what's it going to be? Are you going to call me and prove that I'm bluffing, or are you going to fold and admit that you're a cheat?" He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Vargas's. "I'm waiting," he said, his voice laced with steel. Vargas's face was a mask of indecision. Sweat poured down his forehead and his hands trembled uncontrollably. He glanced at the big man behind him, searching for guidance, but the big man simply shrugged, his expression unreadable. Vargas looked back at Silas, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and fear. He knew that Silas had him cornered. He knew that he couldn't win this game, not without risking everything. He thought of Cale, of the warlord's brutal wrath, of the punishments he had inflicted on those who had failed him. He knew that being exposed as a cheater would be worse than death. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the inevitable. "All right, Silas," he said, his voice hoarse. "You win." He tossed his cards face down onto the table, conceding the hand. A collective gasp swept through the saloon. The patrons erupted in cheers, their faces filled with joy and relief. Silas had done it, he had won. He had saved the children, but Silas knew that the victory was far from complete. Vargas was still a dangerous man, a man who wouldn't hesitate to seek revenge. He had to make sure that Vargas left town and that he never came back. He had to protect the children even after the game was over. The cheering continued, but Silas silenced it with a raised hand. He looked at Vargas, his expression stern. "I expect you to keep your word," Silas said, his voice firm. "You leave the children alone, you ride out of here and never come back, and you tell Cale that you failed." Vargas, his face pale and drawn, nodded slowly. "I will," he said, his voice hoarse. He rose from his chair, his movements stiff and awkward. The big man behind him followed suit, his hand still gripping the handle of his axe. "One more thing," Silas said, stopping Vargas in his tracks. "I want you to tell Cale why you failed. I want you to tell him that you cheated and that you were too afraid to be exposed." Vargas's eyes flashed with anger, but he quickly suppressed it. He knew that Silas was right. He had been caught, and he had no choice but to face the consequences. "I will," he said, his voice barely audible. He turned and strode towards the door, the big man lumbering behind him. Silas watched them go, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He wouldn't relax until they were gone, until he was sure that the children were safe. As Vargas and the big man reached the door, Vargas paused, turning back to face Silas. "This isn't over, Silas Blackwood," he said, his voice filled with venom. "You may have won this battle, but the war is far from over. Cale will not forget this. He will come for you. He will come for these children." Silas met Vargas's gaze without flinching. "I'll be ready," he said, his voice steady, "and so will they." Vargas simply sneered, then turned and stepped out into the night, the saloon doors slamming shut behind him. Silas let out a long, slow breath, the tension slowly draining from his body. He had won. He had saved the children. But he knew that Vargas was right. This wasn't over. Cale was still out there, and he wouldn't let this go. He had to get the children to safety, had to find a place where they would be safe and far away from Cale's reach. He descended into the root cellar, the cheers of the patrons fading behind him. The children were huddled together, their faces pale and drawn. Maya looked up as Silas approached, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and anxiety. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Are we safe?" Silas knelt down, his gaze meeting hers. "It's over for now," he said, his voice gentle. "You're safe here, but we can't stay here. Cale will come looking for you. We need to get you to a place where he can't find you." He explained his plan to the children, telling them that he would arrange for their safe passage to a town called Redemption, a place known for its strong sense of community and its willingness to protect those in need. He told them that he would find a wagon train heading in that direction and that he would pay the wagon master to take them along. The children listened intently, their faces slowly brightening with hope. Maya, however, remained skeptical. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her eyes searching Silas's. "You don't even know us." Silas hesitated for a moment, his gaze drifting towards the trapdoor. He thought of his past, of the choices he had made, of the people he had failed. He thought of the small boy who had reminded him of someone he had lost long ago. "I do know you," Silas said, his voice low. "I see your strength, your courage, your determination to protect each other. You remind me of someone I used to know." He paused, then added, "Besides, everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone deserves to be safe." He stood up, his gaze meeting Maya's. "I'll get everything ready," he said. "You just stay here and rest. You've been through a lot." He turned to leave, but Maya stopped him. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "Thank you for everything." Silas simply nodded, then climbed back up the stairs, his heart filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. He knew that he was doing the right thing, that he was giving these children a chance at a better life. But he also knew that he was sending them away, that he would likely never see them again. He looked around the saloon. He thought to himself, "It's time for a new life for everyone, including me." He walked over to the bar and leaned against the bar, his gaze sweeping over the saloon. The patrons were slowly returning to their drinks and their conversations, the tension gradually dissipating. But Silas knew that things would never be quite the same again. The Dust Devil had become a sanctuary, a place where hope had flickered in the darkness. He poured himself a shot of whiskey, the amber liquid reflecting the flickering lamplight. He took a long swig, the fiery liquid burning a path down his throat. He thought of Maya, of her courage and her determination. He hoped she would be safe, that she would find a new home in redemption. He thought of the small boy, the one who had clung to Maya's hand. He reminded Silas so much of his younger brother, Thomas. Thomas, who had been taken from him so many years ago, a victim of the very same kind of violence that Cale represented. That was why he had been so willing to risk everything for these children. He saw in them a chance to redeem himself, to atone for the sins of his past. He couldn't save Thomas, but maybe, just maybe, he could save these children. He closed his eyes and a flood of memories washed over him. He saw himself as a young man, full of anger and vengeance, seeking to avenge his brother's death. He saw the choices he had made, the violence he had inflicted, the lives he had taken. He had run from that life, had tried to bury his past, to forget the man he had once been. But the past had a way of catching up with you. And tonight, it had caught up with him in the form of 7 frightened orphans seeking refuge from a ruthless warlord. He opened his eyes, his gaze hardening with resolve. He knew that Cale would come. He knew that the war was far from over. But he was ready. He had faced down demons before, and he would face them again. He finished his whiskey and set the glass down on the bar with a